Welcome, everyone. I'm Rabbi Devorah Lynn. I'm co-chair of Jewish Earth Alliance and facilitator of these monthly meetings. And I welcome all of you. Well, before I start, I would like to have our inspiration start from Joyce Wasserman, who is a retired physical therapist, and she awoke to the importance of mitigating climate change in 2012 when she took an online course produced by the World Bank. And it was called Why a 2 Celsius World Must Be Avoided. But it wasn't until her retirement and moving to Florida that she became actively involved in climate change advocacy. And she is a founding member of the Space Coast chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby, or CAST, a small group of Floridian Jews for climate action. And she wants to credit learning about Jewish Earth Alliance from her cousin, Stuart Simon. So please, Joyce, go right ahead.
Thank you for that warm welcome. And thank you, Mirele, for inviting me to do this. And I just want to say that being among climate concerned Jews is very uplifting for me. So thank you, everybody. So one of the things I value about Judaism is that it is flexible. It changes its method with the times. We just celebrated Tu B'Shvat. This holiday has undergone many incarnations over the centuries. In the rabbinic period, Tu B'Shvat was a time that involved trees, but for the purpose of tithing fruit. Later, in the flowering of Jewish mysticism in Safat, it was an occasion for mystical reflection on the tree of life. Take a moment to think about what activities you've associated with Tu B'Shvat. Just unmute or shout it out, please.
Trees.
Thank you. That would be number one, planting trees. When I was a youngster, Tu B'Shvat was a time for raising money to plant trees in Israel. Even from New York City, I felt that I was helping to turn to the desert green. It was a really prideful holiday for Jews in America. Today, we think about Tu B'Shvat as a Jewish Earth Day and a springboard for environmental action. It is now an opportunity to encourage individuals to be more ecologically conscious. We're asked to avoid single-use plastics, take a cloth bag to the supermarket, maybe even a bigger item like invest in rooftop solars. Individual action is a beginning. But the best thing about individual action is it can lead to your friends and your community also adapting good ecological practices. Some congregations organize a day to benefit the community. Here in Florida, this might be a beach cleanup. Maybe in your community, it's planting a communal garden. Even better than this, some synagogues form sustainability committees with missions to make their synagogues make their synagogue buildings more energy inefficient. Committees might also look at the temple's investments and decide to divest from fossil fuel companies. These actions are getting closer to what is needed, but still we have to ask, are the actions enough to lessen the climate crisis that we're headed for? The Bible never uses the word climate catastrophe or mega weather event, but it's filled with stories of natural disasters, upending families and even whole countries. Please share with me a biblical event or story that involves climate changes. Please tell me.
The flood, maybe?
Sure, the flood. I presume you're thinking about Noah's flood.
Noah,
Thank you, Bobby.
yeah.
How about some others?
Plagues.
That's good. The plagues, sure. What about fire? Can you think of any with fire?
Burning bush.
The burning bush. Well, wouldn't call it a climate catastrophe. We sort of look at that one as a good thing. How about Sodom and Gomorrah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
How about, and my cousin's late, I'm sure, because he was supposed to be here and he was supposed to say this one. What about Joseph's dream and the 7 years of good harvest and the 7 years of no food? Probably, a drought or too many weevils. I don't know. Anyway, the first one I thought of was Noah. And we're certainly experiencing catastrophic floods all over the world right now.
Oui.
So Popular Science magazine in a 2020 article interviewed a farmer in the Midwest who explained that the summer plantings were washed out by heavy rains, which was followed by record-breaking rainfall in September. That rainfall wiped out the corn and the soybean crop. The farmer being interviewed had this to say, quote, "It's almost biblical out there. Extreme weather events, for me, and I hope for you, are warnings that we must heed. There are Jewish lessons that provide practical advice to help us keep a stable climate. What Jewish holiday do you think might provide us practical advice, the playbook on what we need to do?" I'll give you a hint. What's the next holiday?
Pesach.
No, the one,
Shabbat?
not Shabbat. We dress up in costumes,
Purim.
masks. We're allowed to get drunk.
Purim.
Purim, yes. And who are the heroes in the Purim story?
Hadassah, the myrtle
Right.
tree.
Esther and
Is this a
Mordecai.
Mordecai?
Or Esther and Mordecai. All right. You notice God does not play a big role in this story.
Mm.
Rabbis, is God even mentioned in the book of Esther?
No.
No.
No. Okay. So two people who choose to get involved, two not particularly religious people, in fact, ordinary citizens, make the miracle happen. So what can Purim teach us? The story of Purim tells us that political activism is a sacred imperative. A Jew sees injustice and is morally impelled to act. For Americans, Washington is our Shushan. Right? And of course, if Washington is our Shushan, that means, guess what? We are Esther's and Mordecai's. So, who was Mordecai anyway? He was a man who refused to bow down to the politically powerful. His action brought him to the attention of the national government. Later, he warned the king of a plot against the throne and thereby ingratiated himself to the king. He was righteous, but he was also a political activist. Who was Esther? She was a woman who, despite her own fears, did what needed to be done. When the decree went out to murder the Jews, she was not in danger. No one knew that Esther was Jewish, but she made a decision to stand by her values, concluding that when others are vulnerable, it is imperative to pay attention and to act, even under dangerous circumstances. What Esther did was lobby the king. She lobbied. She went against protocol and she asked for a meeting, a face-to-face meeting with King Ahasuerus. So from Tu B'Shvat, we learn to protect the earth so that it may continue to sustain us. It is the inspiration for action. From Purim, we learn what the action needs to be. It shows us that political activism can lead to huge successes. The story of Purim promises that people, often those one might not expect, can actually change the world. It says that all of us can be players in a global community and that we can make a difference for ourselves, for our communities, and for humanity. As Mordecai said to Esther in 4:14, perhaps you were made for this moment. Thank you.
Beautiful, beautiful, Joyce. Thank you so much for giving us that review. I've been saying that Tu B'Shvat is the gateway to the spring and summer holidays. And you expressed that very beautifully, that one leads to the other. And just about, and every holiday, I think, can be an environmental climate holiday this year in this Shemitah year. So thank you very much for that. Review from the individual things we can do to the systemic things we can do, and our goal at Jewish Earth Alliance. So it's really great to see, welcome to everybody. It's great to see you all on the call. We hear that we have a lot of people who were referred from the Big Bold Jewish Climate Fest for Tu B'Shvat. So we welcome you. And invite you to come every month to our informative meetings. Don't forget that it's recorded and on our YouTube channel. So if you have friends or colleagues or members of your group who missed this call, they can see it in a day or so on our YouTube channel. So please let them know. So I'd like to take a few minutes to break out into groups of 4 for about 7 or 8 minutes and let you introduce yourselves to each other. And so if you would say your name and where you're sitting right now, and what space you occupy now, a group that if you're affiliated with a group, and let them know what you did. This weekend was impossibly busy. We had the parasha, the portion of Shirat Hayam, crossing the sea, ahead of the Pharaoh and his troops. We had Tu B'Shvat, the New Year of the Trees. We had MLK Day, and we celebrated the work of Martin Luther King and his allies, and were reminded of how it dovetails with our work. Environmental injustice is every part of our work as well. And there were a few other things going on in the news that kind of distracted us. So let's go for 8 minutes. Ed Koff is going to help us with the breakout groups. And so you can have almost 2 minutes for each other. If somebody would be a timer, that would be great. Tell each other how you spent this holiday weekend, this holy day, I think, weekend, and how it informed your work in climate. All right, so we'll welcome you back.
Devorah, let me mention that people may see a pop-up or something at the bottom of their screen that says breakout rooms, and they should accept the invitation.
Okay, and turn on your video if you're able to, so people can see who you are.
Okay, here goes.
So welcome back to everybody. I would like to now introduce our speaker for this evening. Emily Wirzba is a very familiar name around Jewish Earth Alliance. She was part of the gateway for Mirele and I to be introduced to the Washington interreligious staff community. And that is what got us started, really, on the whole thing. Mirele is shaking her head. That's absolutely true. So now Emily Wirzba is a manager of government relations at the Environmental Defense Fund, where she builds relationships with members of Congress. That sounds familiar, and develops strategies to advance the Environmental Defense Fund's transportation, electrification, and climate change priorities. Prior to EDF, Emily was the legislative manager for sustainable energy and environment at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, the Quaker lobby. while at FCNL, this is very Washingtonian, all these initials, while at the Friends Committee, Emily served as co-chair of the Washington Interreligious Staff Communities Energy and Ecology Working Group. And tonight she is going to update us on what's happening. We all have worked very hard this year on the Build Back Better Act. Well, the Jobs Act first and the Build Back Better Act. And there are always ups and downs when you're making sausage, right? When you're making legislation and bills, it can get ugly. But Emily, please give us an update and some strategies and hope for the future for this year. What to do in 22. I like that.
Yes, well, thank you so much. It's really special to be with you all tonight and to see some familiar faces. So I'm really excited to be able to speak with you all. So as was shared, I'm now at the Environmental Defense Fund, working primarily on our clean transportation program, but also doing a lot of other clean energy and climate policy work. And what's wild to me is that I've been with the Environmental Defense Fund for almost 2 years now. I started in April of 2020, so right as the pandemic had first started. And so it's kind of in a strange twist of fate. I've been virtual my entire time in this new role. And so it's been a really nice adventure and I've learned a lot so far, but it's definitely been an unusual way to begin a new job and to try to lobby Congress remotely. But a little bit kind of briefly about the Environmental Defense Fund. We are one of the older environmental nonprofits in the US. We have almost 700 or 800 people globally. So we have offices all over the world and all across the US. And some of our key policy priorities for this Congress has been focusing on legislation that will help electrify our transportation sector and decarbonize our electricity, the two kind of largest emitting sectors in the US. We also work on a number of other issues like reducing methane emissions, trying to electrify heavy duty trucks, working on climate smart agriculture policies, on healthy oceans policies, really the whole gamut. So it's been a really exciting place to be and to learn. So as probably you all have been doing as well, we've spent a lot of this past year focusing first on the bipartisan infrastructure bill and then the second Build Back Better Act. And I do want to just take a moment to celebrate the fact that that the bipartisan infrastructure bill passed and became law. I can't tell you how exciting it is for, I've been doing climate advocacy for almost a decade, and to finally have Congress really laser focused on our issues. It's a really thrilling time. And we're super excited that we saw from this first piece of legislation that is law, that there's significant investments in climate resiliency, in electric school buses and transit buses, and EV charging infrastructure, funding to cap orphan wells to prevent kind of methane leakage, and initial investments to clean out lead from lead service lines in our drinking water. So there were some really good initial investments that I think we should celebrate, while also acknowledging that the majority of our climate and clean transportation and other priorities are still waiting to be passed as part of the Build Back Better Act. So specifically, I've been spending a lot of my time focusing on the tax credits that are in part of this bill, tax credits around clean energy, transportation, and then manufacturing. So we're really hoping that we'll get this across the finish line. And I want to thank everyone on this call who's played a part so far and reaching out to your members of Congress and working to get this passed. So I think it's not all completely doom and gloom. I think there've been some kind of hard headlines to read over the past month or two. We're just, so for folks who maybe haven't been following quite along, the Build Back Better Act is the Biden administration's kind of signature policy platform. It includes some really, really significant climate investments, but also some major policies around poverty and healthcare and a number of other issues. And the way that Congress is trying to pass this bill, so they don't have to have the kind of the 60 votes normally needed for legislation, they're using a process called the budget reconciliation process, which is very technical, but basically what it means is that they can pass something with just 50 votes. The problem is that means that, given the current makeup of the Senate, all 50 votes are needed to get this passed. And several senators have voiced some concerns, including Senator Manchin, who has had some disagreements with Majority Leader Schumer and the White House about the actual cost of the bill and what provisions to include. So a few weeks ago, he came out with a statement saying he's not supportive of the current package that passed the House already and is kind of stalled in the Senate for negotiations right now. So that's kind of on pause. The good news, I think, is that the climate and environmental provisions of that bill are actually in a pretty good place compared to some of the other issues, other really important issues, but things like the child tax credit, which Senator Manchin has said he's not supportive of having included in this bill. So I think when it comes to climate change, people are pretty in agreement that what was included in the House bill, there's support for. There's a few kind of smaller things that they're still working through some disagreements on, things like providing an additional incentive for the EV tax credit if the vehicle was assembled in a union supporting facility. There's some outstanding concerns around a fee on methane emissions, but overall, people are feeling pretty good about the climate provisions. But negotiations kind of between Leader Schumer, Senator Manchin, and the White House have kind of taken a back burner right now because the Senate has been focusing on voting rights and democracy reform last week and this week. So we're kind of in this like little waiting moment where it's up to Leader Schumer and Manchin to really move this conversation forward and figure out, what is it that he'll be comfortable with in order to have the 50 votes to pass this and become law. And so far, as we've seen, kind of bullying and threatening him has not been working. So we got to find kind of other ways to keep up that pressure. And I want to note quickly, there's been a little bit of talk you might have seen in some headlines about, well, what if you just kind of broke up the bill into pieces and do a climate only bill, since that seems to have a lot of support. I want to just be clear that a lot of the environmental community is not advocating for that right now, because we think all of the components of this bill are really important. Even though we're primarily a climate and environmental organization, we don't want to advocate for kind of leaving other priorities behind at this point. So we'll see what happens. So briefly on voting rights, what's happening this week. The Senate did this kind of procedural trick where they can actually begin debate on the voting rights bill in the Senate, which is kind of exciting, but they don't have the 60 votes needed to break the filibuster, so they can end debate and actually vote on the bill. So, despite this, Leader Schumer is actually still discussing filibuster reform, which would mean that they wouldn't need the 60 votes. And while maybe some senators are open to a few tweaks to the filibuster, not getting rid of it completely, Senator Sinema from Arizona is actually opposed to any change to the filibuster at all, meaning they're kind of stuck because they don't have any way to remove the 60 vote threshold that's needed. But because this has been such a huge issue that Democrats campaigned on, it was a campaign promise to do voting rights work. It looks like Senator Schumer, as of now, he might still force a vote this week, knowing that it will fail, just to try to get people on record for their stance on ending debate and moving forward to vote on this bill. So it's all kind of high drama and unclear where things will land, but it looks like they don't have the votes to do anything at this time. Another just kind of thing I wanted to note, because I know this is something that you all have been following. Tomorrow at 12 noon, the Natural Resources Committee in the House is actually having a hearing on the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. And so this is a process where the committee kind of takes a formal look at a bill and decides and votes on whether or not to move it forward. So that is happening tomorrow at noon for those who are following that bill. So I want to, I kind of was in the weeds on a few issues, but I want to take a step back and talk through some important dates that are going to come up this year in 2022, kind of what I think, how I see this playing out and what might happen. So a few dates to know: on February 18th is when there's a new government funding deadline where Congress is going to have to figure out something to keep the government open and funded. So they've been working really hard on something called an omnibus, which is basically kind of the current like the spending bills that Congress has been working on for this past year. The problem is what Congress has typically done in recent years is they just pass something called a continuing resolution to fund the government, which basically means you're not creating a new spending bill each year. You're just like hitting forward and continuing on at levels that were in the past because people can't come to an agreement. So we're really hoping that they don't just do a continuing resolution because that would mean funding levels for agencies like the EPA that were similar to what the Trump administration had. So we're hoping that Democrats can kind of pass their own spending bill by February 18th, but that is going to be like a high pressure moment for Congress. And then on March 1st, we just heard that's going to be the State of the Union. And so some people think that Congress is going to use that as like a little deadline to see if they can pass the Build Back Better Act by March 1st, so President Biden can talk about his legislative accomplishments. It's not really a strict deadline, it's kind of a false creative one, but we'll see if that kind of can be when they try to aim to get something over the finish line. And if not, you know, the Build Back Better Act, if, you know, as negotiations continue, they could pass that in March or April. It really could be anytime in the next couple of months. It just depends on how negotiations are going. And so because it's kind of a funny year, it's an election year. And so Congress, it's always like kind of the later you get in the year, the harder it is to actually work with Congress because they start to think about their reelection campaigns. And so, you know, as the summer goes on, it'll be harder and harder to get Congress to do productive things. I think a few kind of strategies to look for in the coming months, you know, continued advocacy on the Build Back Better Act is really, really vital. Being able to continue to build a relationship with your members of Congress, to call their offices, to send them emails, to write op-eds, making sure they know that the Build Back Better Act is really, really crucial and remains a priority for you. That really will help provide senators with the encouragement to get this across the finish line. But in addition to that, I think using the congressional hearing process could be a really interesting opportunity to advance kind of the messages on issues that you're working on. So like this hearing I mentioned tomorrow, as Congress is kind of debating and talking about specific legislation, it's a great time to do education and build awareness around what's going on. And then continue to think about the appropriations or spending process. They're still trying to vote on a bill to keep the government open, you know, in the next couple of weeks and funded, but they're also working to write their spending bill for fiscal year 23, the next coming up year. And so that's a great opportunity to talk about specific priorities and programs that you really like that the government has and that you want to see funded. And then the last thing that I'll mention is kind of unique to this year, but the federal government did just pass, you know, this bipartisan infrastructure bill that was signed into law. And so now all of these agencies have significant pots of money that they have to implement for these new grant programs. So one quick example, the EPA has now received $5 billion for a new clean school bus program. $2.5 billion will go towards electric school buses. 2.5 billion will go for cleaner fuel school buses. And so this is a great time to do advocacy with the EPA on how you want that money to be spent. And so kind of examples of things you could think about, you know, making sure that there's equitable distribution of the funds and that kind of low-income school districts and other vulnerable places are able to get access to that funding. So that's just like one very specific example, but the federal government is about to get a lot of money. And so it's a great way to kind of give input on if you have specific advice or like kind of things for people to take in mind as they're building up these brand new programs to help with to help advance kind of climate and equity goals. So that was kind of a lot of information I just shared, but I want to just kind of maybe end before we take some questions that I continue to remain optimistic. I think the spotlight with Congress is on climate and environmental issues for, you know, in a very serious way for the first time in my career. And I think this is really, it's not the moment to give up or to despair. I think the newspaper loves to have headlines that are kind of doom and gloom. And but I think in reality, people are really serious about still trying to get these bills finished. And so I'm really, I think constituent advocacy is like the most important thing that can be done right now to help make sure our senators are paying attention. So I'll stop with that.
Great, great, a great review of all that's going on and helping us to understand some of the intricacies of what's going on as well, and the challenges. Brent Corson has a question. I wanted to just that said, would love to know what is EDF's thinking regarding how to push Manchin and Cinema on Build Back Better, which is now on the back burner while voting rights is on center stage. And I just, as dovetailing that, I was thinking, you said that Manchin is really supportive of the climate stuff, and in spite of everybody accusing him of being in the pocket of coal. So that kind of threw me, that that doesn't seem to be the reason he's giving to be against the bill. So can you talk to us about that, and if there is anything that can be done with the two of them?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the most important thing to remember is that senators really only listen to their own state's interest. And so it can be really tempting to want to, call or reach out to senators that maybe don't represent your state. And I think Manchin and Cinema are probably getting a lot of outreach from people who aren't from West Virginia and Arizona. So I think the way that we're looking at it is figuring out, what are people in West Virginia and Arizona really saying? What do they care about? And lifting up examples and stories of how the Build Back Better Act will actually help West Virginians or help people in Arizona. So kind of making that case. And then an interesting example is that a electric vehicle manufacturer just announced that they're going to be opening a new plant in West Virginia to build electric school buses in West Virginia. And that announcement came out last week. And that's a great kind of example of a story of kind of why this federal funding can help create jobs in those states. And so really trying to figure out, kind of what the story is based off of who these people represent is the most effective way. And often that means that maybe you can't do anything yourself in terms of direct outreach to them, but maybe somebody in those places that you could reach out to, or supporting organizations that are in those states doing that kind of work. And to the larger question, I think one thing that we've heard from Senator Manchin is that he's deeply concerned about inflation and rising costs. And in order to keep the total cost of the Build Back Better Act something that everyone was comfortable with, that could get 50 votes, some of the programs like the child tax credit was only kind of on the books for several years, because instead of the full 10 years, which is like the span of the timeline of the bill takes. And so I think one of Senator Manchin's points was that, look, let's be realistic. We're not actually going to pass a child tax credit for just 3 or 4 years. It's actually, we're going to extend it and we're going to keep it for 10 years. And so that means the bill is actually going to cost a lot more than you're saying it's going to cost. So his point is like, be honest about what the bill will cost, and let's make some decisions on kind of what our priorities should be. So for him, I think a lot of it comes down to the cost of the bill. And we can have personal disagreements with that, but that's kind of the position that he's taking.
Yeah. The Poor People's Campaign was certainly out there every week, were they, or every other week? And it doesn't seem to have been effective because they're outsiders. They're not West Virginians mostly, I guess. So another question is, we have the link for the Wildlife Act hearings in the chat if you want to click on that link to save it. And from Murray Lantner, can a separate climate change bill be pushed through the regular way and overcome a Republican filibuster and get enacted without reconciliation?
That is a great question. Very likely the answer is no. So I think when you hear people talk about potentially like a climate only bill, I think under that scenario, Congress would have to pass another budget resolution, so do a second reconciliation bill. So it would be similar. It would have like a similar kind of structure. You have to only having to have 50 votes, and it would limit what kinds of things could be in the bill. So the tool that Democrats are using right now, all of the provisions have to do with spending and revenue. They can't be kind of just new policy related. And so So this bill, the thought process would be they'd have to kind of start over from scratch, pass a new budget resolution so they could have a new reconciliation process, and it would be climate only. And I think it's just, that would take a really long time. And also you would really alienate a lot of other members of Congress who have had as their top priorities some of these other things like the child tax credit and some of the healthcare provisions. And so it just gets really tricky once you start splitting it up, because then there's a lot of infighting and nobody wants to decide what's more important. Helping children in poverty, addressing climate change, all these things are important. And so I think I don't know how viable that path will be. We'll see.
Okay. Joyce Wasserman asks, is price on carbon still on the table for the budget reconciliation resolution?
So a price on carbon was not included in the House Build Back Better Act that passed the House.
Yeah, the
a few
White
months
House
ago.
bill. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so that wasn't included. I do know that senators are still talking about it. I think it's not kind of front and center in the negotiations, but there's always a chance that could be used as a way to generate revenue to help pay for the Build Back Better Act. I remain skeptical that will end up being added into the package, just because I'm not sure that 50 senators support that policy right now, but it's definitely still being talked about as part of the broader conversations.
Yeah, and Mirele is asking, what can we do to push to reduce methane emissions? Do you know what is happening with the administration's methane reduction action plan?
That's a good question. I don't actually know what's happening with the administration. My colleague handles all of our oil and gas and methane work, but I do know that that continues to be kind of one of the points up for negotiation still in the Build Back Better Act. So I think they were working on a compromise language in that legislation to actually reduce methane emissions. But I don't have, unfortunately, any updates on kind of the regulatory administration side.
Who's that at the Environmental Defense Fund? Who's your colleague who works on oil?
Her name is Reza Orleans.
Reza Orley.
She's on the federal affairs team with me, and she handles that portfolio.
Yeah. All right. And as oops, I got to plug in. And as is there any Republican sponsored bills that might decrease emissions?
So I will say, I've a lot of my work kind of at EDF, but also especially when I was at the Friends Committee, was working with Republicans in Congress to see what policies they'd support to reduce emissions. And I think we've definitely seen an improvement in terms of the number of Republicans willing to engage on climate change. There is one price on carbon legislation called the Market Choice Act that Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick, a Republican from Pennsylvania, has sponsored and introduced. But that's the only kind of larger Republican supported bill to reduce emissions. I think there's some kind of smaller bills that look at more like sectoral specific policies. So Republican bills around kind of agriculture solutions and energy storage, kind of specific tax credits, but no kind of comprehensive legislation.
Let's see. Lavona Gross says, will EDF be active in agency oversight of the implementation of the infrastructure bill, such as ensure that frontline, fence line communities get the funds they were promised? What role should the faith community play in this oversight?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we definitely will be involved in the implementation and oversight. So what's happening is a number of the agencies they're putting out requests for information. So like kind of formal requests. So anyone can send in feedback. So we've been working, comments to things like this new pot of money at the Department of Energy around EV charging infrastructure, the EPA's Clean School Bus Program, and a couple of other ones. And that's definitely something like equity and kind of equitable access to funding is something that we're highlighting in each of our comments. And I think for the faith community in particular, it's a great time to talk about kind of how your own particular values show and shape where you think the money should be prioritized and spent. And so really highly encourage, if that's something that you're interested in, to send in comments. And they don't have to be overly technical. I think it can be kind of, everyone has their own levels of expertise. And so it doesn't have to be necessarily technical expertise. It can also be kind of moral considerations and things values to prioritize. And there's a number of different types of comments I think that groups will be submitting. And so a few weeks ago, I sat in on a listening session that the EPA did for the Clean School Bus Program, and there were all sorts of people who spoke, environmental justice organizations, individual school district administrators that actually have electric buses themselves. I mean, it was really kind of a broad spectrum, and it was really exciting to see.
Well, I want to thank you very much for coming tonight to catch us up on what has been a frustration, certainly, in getting this thing passed. I wanted to just leave with this thought from Murray. If we fight for the whole kitchen sink, we may get nothing. Why? Can you clarify why we wouldn't focus on a separate climate bill and get it done? You began explaining that. Perhaps a little.
I think a few reasons right now. One, it's not guaranteed that would get all 50 votes needed to pass either, because there are senators who would be really upset that the poverty and healthcare provisions were left out. And so I don't think we know for sure that we would be able to pass that yet. And I think the kind of other main reason is that there's still kind of hope for negotiations to kind of pass the bill in its entirety. And we don't want to be in a position of like picking kind of which issues should be left out and what's more important. And so I mean, who knows, like maybe that's where the conversation will go if the next couple months don't go very well for negotiations. But I think we're still optimistic that we can get most of what was passed in the House bill.
And actually everything is all interrelated anyway, right? So although those are separate things in the budget, they're all interrelated. Well, thank you very much, Emily. It's been great having a relationship with you, and we'll continue to work with you over at the Environmental Defense Fund as well. And thanks so much for being with us tonight, and particularly this Q&A is always really very helpful for us in our strategy focusing. And that leads me to turn the turn the video over to Mirele Goldsmith, co-chair and co-founder, to discuss what our priorities are for 2022. What can we do in 2022? So Mirele, you ready?
Oh, everybody, and happy Tu B'Shvat.
Thank you.
Great to see you. My job is to remind you that each of you can be a hero. As Joyce reminded us earlier, we have so many heroes in our tradition that we can emulate. And as we turn from Tu B'Shvat to Purim, we can think about Queen Esther. Queen Esther was just a regular citizen when she was appointed to be the queen, right? But she stepped up. She asked others to help her. She was an organizer. Do you remember what she asked? She asked her friends and family to fast, I think for 3 days. Is that right? 3 days?
It's always 3 days.
You can ask them for something much easier than that. And she was persistent. She went back and met with the king 3 times before she got what she wanted, right? I'm looking at Elliot. Am I right? I think I'm right. So let's all think about Queen Esther as we begin this new year of 2022. I really want to thank Emily for giving us, the positive take. A lot of the things that she talked about that are in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act and are going to happen are things that we advocated for, like the weatherization funds, the money for electric vehicle chargers. I wrote them all down somewhere, but there were a lot of things we worked on. So pat yourself on the back. Everyone pat yourself on the back. Okay? we're making some progress. And this year we're going to make even more. I want to thank all of you for all that you already do. Like I just, in the breakout group, I spoke with Murray. Is Murray still here? Murray, wave to us if you're still, he's probably on, put himself, he probably turned off it. There he is, Murray. Murray told me that he wrote to his legislators with his family about the Recovering Wildlife, America's Wildlife Act. And that bill has bipartisan support. So we're going to keep working on that. That's going to be one of our priorities because that is something that really can pass. Read the action alert for why it's so important. I'm not going to go into it now, but it's really important and we're going to keep working on it. We're also going to be working on methane emissions. You know, methane emissions are increasing. Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, more potent in the short term than carbon dioxide. And those emissions are increasing. They're increasing because we're substituting gas for coal and oil. But as Louise, is Louise here? Louise, if you're here, wave to us. Louise has been teaching us, it's also because the oil and gas companies, the fossil fuel industry is pushing for more plastics because that will provide a market for the methane. So we need to stop that before it really gets going. So we have a lot of work to do on methane. And then our third priority right now, which interestingly Emily didn't mention, is a healthy democracy. Because unless we as citizens can get our voice heard, and in contrast to just the fossil fuel industry, which is pouring so much money into our electoral system and corrupting it, we can't accomplish our goals. So those are our three priorities for the next few months. And we want to ask you to get even more involved and help us make the case to Congress on those issues. And we're asking that all of you consider working with us to plan a lobbying meeting with your members of Congress. And we hope to be able to really support you and make it easy for you, but really have our voice heard at the beginning of this term. Our push is going to be to do this in February, because as you heard from Emily, as the year goes on, the attention of members of Congress is going to go more and more to the election and less to the legislation that we need them to pass. So we're going to be calling on you for that. I want to end by saying, I don't know if any of you have ever thought about how old Esther was when she became the queen. According to, it doesn't say in the Megillah, but
14.
according to the Midrash, the Jewish teachings and legends that interpret what is in the story, the basic story of Esther, she was either 40 years old, 74 years old, or 80 years old. I think we can each take that for as an inspiration that it's never too late to step up our game and do what we can to make this world a better place. So I wish you all a wonderful month, and we'll be following up with you to help you to meet with Congress and achieve some more of our goals this year.
Thank you so much, Mirele, for rousing the troops, rousing and raising the troops. I have two things to end with. One is that on NPR, they had a little article. This is in relationship to what Emily said about how she's been at Environmental Defense Fund for 2 years, totally by virtually. And they reported that cows in England are being given virtual, what it's called? Virtual, glasses to simulate that they are out in the fields when the weather's not good and they can't go out in the fields. And darn it, don't they give better and more milk, sweeter and better milk than they would if they were stuck in the barn. So being virtual has its benefits, and it has certainly had its benefits for Jewish Earth Alliance. I know, I thought that was a really funny thing. And it has its benefits for us that we can see you all from across the country all at the same time, and that we can arrange meetings for you with your members of Congress. So keep up that connection with us. So thank you all so much for coming tonight. I want to end with a blessing, and I'm so glad that people came from the Big Bold Jewish Climate Fest. That's really terrific that that you saw us through them, and I hope that you will come. We have our meetings every third Tuesday at this same time, 8 o'clock Eastern time, and 5 o'clock Western time, and everything in between. And we hope that we will see you again, and that if you are interested in joining with us and want to become one of our partners, please make the connection with our website. It's very easy to sign up, and it's a very transparent website. It's not very complicated. So thank you all. Thank you to our speakers, Joyce Wasserman and Emily Wirzba and Mirele Goldsmith, and to our tech aficionado, Ed Kopf, who is always so helpful with getting the meeting, making the meeting run smoothly. So, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shenatan lanu hizdamnut litakem et haolam. Someone mentioned, I think it was Joyce. Oh yes, that Esther said that she blessed God, she was blessed to have this opportunity. This is what she was born for, that Mordecai told her, this is what she was born for. And this blessing says, blessed is the eternal intelligence of the universe for giving us this opportunity to mend the world at this time in the history of the universe, in the history of humankind in particular.
I gotta
So
go.
thank you all for pursuing justice, Rodef Tzedek. Keep it up, keep the faith, and keep your spirits up by going out, by having moments of joy, because that is one way to continue to give us hope and strength to carry on. All right. Good night, everybody. Thank you. And we'll see you next